All right, let's dive deep into a Supreme Court case that I think really makes you stop and think about the limits of government power.
Oh.
Especially when it comes to like your personal property and your money.
Right.
It's the case of Tyson Timbs v. Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And just imagine for a second,
Yeah.
the government saying, okay, you were convicted of a drug offense, so we're going to take your Land Rover.
Oh, wow.
Which, by the way, was worth $42,000.
Yeah. That's
not a small,
a lot.
that's a big chunk of change.
Yeah.
And the real question at the heart of this case was, does the Eighth Amendment's protection against excessive fines,
Right.
something we all have at the federal level,
Uh-huh.
does that also apply to state governments? Because if not,
Yeah.
that means states could potentially impose
Mhm.
just really hefty, huge financial penalties.
Right.
And is there any kind of constitutional check on that power?
Yeah. That's a big question.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating.
It is.
So Tyson Timbs, convicted on drug charges. Now, he was facing a potential 20-year sentence,
Wow.
ended up receiving a 6-year sentence.
Okay.
But on top of that,
Yeah.
the state went after his vehicle,
Right.
worth, as we said, way more
Way more.
than any fine he might have paid.
Right.
So right away, you see that tension
Yes.
of, is this proportionate?
Absolutely.
Is this fair?
Yeah.
So before we get into all the legal arguments back and forth,
Okay.
what was the final verdict? Did the Supreme Court say that the Eighth Amendment's excessive fines clause applies to states?
The court said yes.
Okay.
Unanimously.
Wow, unanimous.
It does apply to the states.
So a big win for Mr. Timbs.
Yeah.
And really anyone who might be facing these kinds of penalties at the state level.
Right.
So let's break down
Okay.
how they got to that decision.
Sure.
Tim's legal team, they started with a really basic point.
Yeah.
They said this idea of excessive financial penalties.
Uh-huh.
This is not something new.
Right.
This goes way back
Yeah.
to like Magna Carta territory.
Absolutely. Like,
Way, way back.
Yeah.
This idea that the government shouldn't be able to just levy whatever disproportionate financial penalty they want.
right.
That's been a concern for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So were there any hints along the way from previous Supreme Court cases
Oh, yeah.
that maybe they were already leaning in this direction
Yeah.
and saying, hey, this should apply to the states?
Yeah.
What did they point to?
So over the past 30 years, several times the court has kind of mentioned that this freedom from excessive fines should probably apply to the states.
Okay, so not directly ruling on it,
Not directly, but
kind of hinting.
definitely signaling. Yeah.
All right, so they're building this case based on history, based on kind of like the court's own
Certain precedent.
little, like breadcrumbs, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
That was really key to this case.
Yeah.
Why did they focus on that, and specifically the due process clause?
So the 14th Amendment, it was passed after the Civil War. Okay. And it was all about making sure states couldn't take away basic rights
Okay,
from people.
got it.
And there are two big parts of it
Okay.
that we use for this kind of argument.
Okay,
Due process clause and the privileges or immunities clause.
okay,
And while they acknowledge the privileges or immunities clause could be used,
okay,
they really focused on the due process clause
okay.
because that's how the court has usually incorporated rights from the Bill of Rights to apply to the states.
Okay.
And their argument was pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
If it's a fundamental right,
Mm-hmm.
then states have to respect that.
Okay.
No watering it down.
So a right's a right,
Right.
no matter who's trying to infringe on it.
Exactly.
Now, we have to talk about forfeiture,
Yes.
because that's what happened here, right?
Great.
The government was taking property.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to argue that that actually counted as a fine
They did.
under the Eighth Amendment.
Right.
So how did they do that?
Well, they had a Supreme Court case on their side,
Okay, which one?
Austin v. United States
Okay.
from 1993. And in that case, the court unanimously said that civil in rem forfeitures.
Okay, break that down for us. What does in rem mean?
So in rem basically means that it's an action directed at the property itself,
Okay.
not necessarily the owner.
So it's like the property is the target.
Exactly.
Got it.
Regardless of who owns it.
Okay.
They said these forfeitures are fines if they're meant to punish.
Okay.
So that was a big win for Timbs right there.
Right, because they could point back to that and
Exactly.
say, hey, this is already established. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got forfeiture equals a fine in this case.
Uh-huh.
But how do you decide if a fine is excessive?
That's the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
What's the standard?
So they pointed to another case, Bachakajian v. United States,
Okay.
and that case said it's not a simple formula. You have to look at all the circumstances. It's very fact-specific.
Got it.
So Timbs' lawyers argued that same kind of thinking should be happening in these state-level cases, too.
Interesting. So they were basically saying, don't oversimplify this.
Yeah.
Look at the whole picture.
Right.
They also brought up the 14th Amendment again.
They did.
And specifically the original intent behind it.
Right.
What was their argument there?
They said one of the main reasons the 14th Amendment was passed was to guarantee all Americans basic rights. And that includes this protection against excessive fines and penalties.
So no matter which level of government is trying to...
Federal, state, doesn't matter.
Got it.
And they said Indiana, by allowing this, was basically going against that fundamental purpose.
Going against that very reason that the 14th Amendment exists.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, we have to acknowledge in rem forfeiture, it's got a long history.
It does.
And a lot of people find it controversial.
Right.
Did Tim's team address that? This idea that historically these types of forfeitures have been treated differently?
They did.
Like not subject to the same proportionality concerns. How did they address that?
Well, they said even traditional forms of forfeiture shouldn't be totally exempt from the excessive fines clause.
Okay.
Especially if they're really meant to punish.
Okay.
And if they're disproportionate.
So look at the substance, not just the name.
Right.
Okay.
And they pointed back to that Austin case again.
Right.
Which said if it's even partly meant to punish, the excessive fines clause should apply.
Interesting. So they were making it clear that they're not saying get rid of all forfeiture.
No, not at all.
Just saying, hey, there needs to be some kind of check here.
Right. A reasonableness standard.
Okay. Now, in terms of like real world examples, what did they point to kind of show why this protection was so important at the state level?
Well, they mentioned that federal courts had already started coming up with ways to figure out if a fine is excessive. After that Bahekajin ruling.
Right.
And they said state courts should be able to do the same thing using the Eighth Amendment.
Got it.
Now, here's the thing.
Yeah.
They pointed out that fines and forfeitures, they're kind of different from other punishments.
How so?
Because they actually bring in money for the government.
Oh, that's a good point.
Right. So there's a potential for states to maybe go a little overboard.
Right. It's almost like a profit motive in a way.
Exactly.
Which you don't really have with other types of punishment.
Right.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Now, they also talked about the Land Rover itself.
They did.
And its connection to the crime.
Right.
What did they say about that?
Well, they acknowledged it was used in connection with the drug offenses.
Okay.
But they argued just because it was used doesn't automatically mean you can just take it.
Especially a $42,000?
Right, and especially given the other circumstances.
Right.
The specifics of what happened and the fact that he was already getting 6 years in prison.
So they kept going back to that proportionality idea.
Right.
Okay, now I read that they even brought up this old idea from the Magna Carta called salvo contenimento, which, being a legal scholar, I'm very familiar with.
Of course.
But for our listeners who might not know Latin, what does that mean?
So it means basically that punishments shouldn't leave someone completely destitute without anything.
So don't take everything.
Right.
Don't completely ruin someone's life.
Exactly.
Got it.
And while they weren't saying Timbs was left destitute, they said this principle is still important.
Right, that idea of taking too much.
Yeah.
Now, did they have any real-world examples where courts had actually found that forfeitures were excessive?
Yeah, they pointed to some federal cases where that had already happened.
Okay, so there's precedent for this.
Right.
Okay, so that's their argument.
And one last thing.
Yeah. They argued that the specific Indiana law that was used in Tim's case was actually even more focused on punishment than the federal law in that Austin case.
So.
Because it required the state to prove that Timbs knew or should have known about the criminal activity.
So there's an element of
intent
there.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tim's side presented a really thorough argument.
They did.
With lots of different angles.
Absolutely.
But what about Indiana? What was their defense?
So Indiana basically said they might agree that the excessive fines clause should apply to states.
Okay.
If it's a fine that's directly imposed on a person.
Okay.
But they said in rem forfeitures, actions against property, those are different.
Okay, so they're trying to draw a distinction based on the type of penalty.
Right.
Okay, interesting.
And they said historically, these types of forfeitures, they weren't subject to the same rules about being proportionate.
So their argument really hinges on history.
This is how it's always been done.
Right.
Okay, so did they point to any cases where the court had treated Bill of Rights protections differently?
Yeah, they did.
Like differently between the federal government and the states?
Right.
Okay. What do they point to?
Some older cases where the court had focused on whether a right was implicit in the concept of ordered liberty.
Okay.
Which suggests a more flexible approach to incorporation.
Okay, so maybe not a direct one-to-one.
Right.
Got it.
And to kind of prove their point.
Yeah.
They use some pretty extreme examples.
Oh, like what?
Like, imagine someone gets a speeding ticket.
Okay.
But they're driving a Bugatti.
Okay.
And that Bugatti was used to commit the crime.
Okay.
So the state wants to take the Bugatti.
Okay.
They said under this broad application of the excessive fines clause, that could potentially be challenged.
Right, even though it's a Bugatti.
Right, even though it seems really out of proportion.
But they were using that as a way to show that historically these in rem forfeitures have been pretty harsh.
Right.
Okay, so their concern is that this ruling could potentially
open the floodgates.
Yeah, to all kinds of challenges.
Right.
That could really change how forfeiture has been done.
Exactly.
Okay, what about innocent owners?
Yeah, they brought that up too.
Like people who maybe didn't even know their property was being used for criminal activity?
Right.
What do they say about that?
They argued that this ruling would basically overturn centuries of legal precedent.
Okay.
Where innocent owners could still lose their property.
If it was connected to a crime somehow.
Right.
Okay.
Because proportionality wasn't really a big factor in those cases.
Got it.
And they said, look, the line between punitive forfeitures and remedial forfeitures,
right.
It's not that clear.
Right, because Timbs' argument really relied on this idea that it was punitive, right?
Exactly.
So they're saying, well, even that distinction
is blurry.
Is blurry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they said, if you apply this grossly disproportionate test to every in rem forfeiture, you're basically wiping out this whole history.
Okay.
And the government's power to take property that's used in crimes.
Regardless of who owns it.
Right.
Interesting. So really, their argument comes down to history.
It does.
And saying that history needs to be a central part
Absolutely.
of how the court interprets the Constitution in this case. Now, what about more recent cases?
Yeah.
Like a McDonald v. City of Chicago.
Right, the Second Amendment case.
Yeah. How did they try to use that to support their argument?
They argued that the McDonald case, it really focused on the specific right that was being claimed.
Which was?
The right to bear arms for self-defense.
Right.
And so they said in Timbs' case, the specific right isn't just a general freedom from excessive fines.
Okay.
It's a right to proportionality.
Okay.
Specifically when it comes to in rem forfeitures.
Ah, so they're trying to get very specific.
Very.
And saying, this is the right that's at stake here.
This is the one we need to focus on historically.
Okay, and how did McDonald factor into that?
Well, they pointed out that in McDonald, the court didn't change the basic scope of the Second Amendment after incorporating it.
Right.
So they said similarly, incorporating the excessive fines clause shouldn't totally change how we understand in rem forfeiture.
So it's like, don't rock the boat too much.
Right.
Okay.
They were really insistent that in rem forfeitures need to be treated differently because of their history.
So a very history-focused argument.
Yeah.
All right. So what was Timbs' team's final response?
In their rebuttal, they basically said Indiana wasn't really disagreeing with the main idea,
which is
that the excessive fines clause should apply to the states.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to fines that are directly imposed on a person.
Okay.
And they reminded the court that they'd said similar things many times before.
Right, like those breadcrumbs we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they said if the court ruled against incorporation in this case, it would be a huge step back.
How so?
Because it would basically overturn the Austin decision, which was unanimous.
Right. Everyone agreed on that.
Everyone.
Okay.
And that decision clearly said these forfeitures are fines.
Right.
So they said this would create this loophole where states could just get around the excessive fines clause.
By calling it something else.
Exactly. Just by labeling it an in rem forfeiture.
Interesting.
And they said that's basically that two-track approach to incorporation.
Right. One standard for the feds, one for the states.
And the court has rejected that.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they said, look, even if some forfeitures aren't meant to punish,
the
forfeiture in Timbs' case clearly was at least partly meant to punish.
Right. It met that Austin test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they said, remember, the Indiana law is actually even more punitive.
Right, because of that knowledge requirement.
Exactly.
Okay, so a lot of back and forth.
A lot of arguments.
But ultimately, the court sided with Timbs.
They did.
Affirmed that the excessive fines clause does apply to the states.
It does.
But, and this is important,
yeah,
this doesn't mean that every question about forfeiture is settled.
No, not at all.
Right. It doesn't tell us exactly what excessive means.
Right. It's the big question that remains.
And that's going to have to be worked out.
In future cases.
Yeah, in the lower courts.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting to think about how much power the government has to take people's property.
It is.
And what are the safeguards to prevent abuse?
Absolutely.
I think this case, Timbs v. Indiana, it really highlights that even something that seems like a pretty straightforward constitutional principle can have huge ripple effects.
It can.
On everyday people's lives.
Yeah, for sure.
And their economic security.
Absolutely.
So it's about more than just legal theory.
Way more.
It's about real people and their money and their property and their freedom.
Yeah.
Now, for our 10th chair segment, where I get to pretend I'm on the Supreme Court.
I like this segment.
And offer my own opinion.
Yeah.
So if I were deciding this case, here's where I would have landed.
Okay.
I respect the arguments that Indiana made.
Yeah.
About the history of in rem forfeiture. But for me, the Eighth Amendment, it's really about preventing the government from going overboard.
Right.
With financial punishments.
No matter what we call them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to say that because something has been done a certain way for a long time means it's automatically okay, I think that creates a dangerous loophole.
I agree.
Because then you could have states potentially just coming up with all sorts of ways to get around.
To get around the Constitution.
Yeah, just by labeling it differently.
Right.
And I think the 14th Amendment, that was meant to ensure fairness.
Across the board.
Yeah, for everyone.
Yeah.
So I think the focus should be on the penalty itself. Is it excessive?
Right.
Not just the name that we give it.
I agree.
So I would have sided with the majority.
Okay.
Saying the excessive fines clause applies to the states. Now, figuring out what excessive means in practice.
Yeah, that's tricky.
That's a whole other...
That's up in the lower courts.
Yeah, that's for another day.
Right.
But I think the principle is clear. States shouldn't be able to impose these disproportionate financial penalties.
Absolutely not.
Including forfeitures.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important safeguard for individual liberty.
I agree.
And that's what the Constitution is all about.
That's it.
All right, well, that's our deep dive into Timbs v. Indiana.
Fascinating case.
It really is.
A lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in future cases.
Absolutely.
So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that.
We will.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.